All right, everyone. Hi, welcome in to your second session of Box Talks. I know it's been a long time coming, but I assure you, and I hope it was worth the wait. All right, so welcome to session 2. As I've stated before, we are going to be talking about video nasties and also censorship and exploitation film. These three topics are very intertwined with each other, and you'll see as we go through our good old terribly made PowerPoint and legally distinct PowerPoint that these are all very closely related. And as usual, per Box Talks, a forward. There is a lot to cover and talk about. Wow, who would have guessed, but especially so this time, because we are covering a very large period of time in this Box Talk session. We're talking about a good 50 to 60 years of film history. So it's understandable that I kind of have to skim over things. Factors, movements, legislations, a whole giant mess of things that I wish I could cover, but I simply do not have the time. As we are covering a lot of time in such a short frame, films and film genres and categories mentioned here will only be a quick summary. We are not doing a big deep dive into one specific film like I did with Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in my first Box Talks, because that was really only one movement. This is essentially multiple movements. And even then, with Video Nasties, there are way too many films for me to cover. So again, it will only be a quick summary. Yeah, there's way too many films in the time frame. And some content within some genres and categories can and will have concerning content. And for the sake of my own channel, primarily my own channel and my audience, I won't be talking about it in detail. So, yeah. That being said, if anything within this Box Talks strikes your fancy in some way, shape, or form, please dig into this topic. I will keep repeating this throughout the slide, throughout my presentation. All right, seriously, this is a giant web of interconnected shenanigans that plays off of each other in more ways than you think. So, what are we covering today? First, censorship in film. What exactly is that? We're covering, the marketing, which is, I've mentioned in my first session. Film is an industry. If there's one thing I want you to keep in mind, in the back of your head, throughout any form of Box Talks, unless otherwise stated, film is an industry. Keep that in mind. So we're covering the marketing, why censorship is scary to companies, and this may sound familiar for those who have been to my first Box Talks, so keep that in mind as well. The content, what is grounds for censorship, and then we go on to early censorship in the US. So we'll be covering the don'ts and be carefuls, and also the Hays Code. And these two are very important pieces of documents, or legislation, air quotes on legislation, that dictates how film censorship in the US went about during this time period. And then from there we'll go on to exploitation cinema, which is a product of the Hays Code specifically. So what is it? And a whole bunch of examples. You will learn very quickly that there are a lot of genres or subgenres within exploitation cinema. And going off from there, we will finally be covering video nasties, which will be essentially what are they, and the key figure known as Mary Whitehouse and legislation. Yeah, there's a lot of legislation we're going to be covering today. I hope that isn't too scary. So, good luck me. And the DPP 72 and Section 3. We will also be covering those. Those are a list of, if I had to preview now, those are a list of films that were brought under review for various reasons and their relation to being video nasties. So, and yes, of course, post video nasties, the relaxation of censorship, and how with the changing of certain things, certain social things came just a relaxation of censorship. So more films got to be screened for various reasons. So, censoring films. The marketing. As I've talked before, if briefly during my first box talk, censoring films is often a case of publishers and producers worrying about the business of films rather than the art of films. To executives and people who are concerned with making money, films being censored is usually bad because of various reasons. Remember that film is an industry. Censorship possibly led to a small audience, which obviously means less money, which is not good in the eyes of those who are heads of these various production companies and distributors. Bad publicity and news often pushed possible viewership away, more often than it brought viewers in, though that sometimes isn't the case with such things. If you remember Dracula and its very interesting history in regards to how it was marketed, this may sound very familiar. Companies and distributors would go out of their way to avoid being censored through various means, like Dracula. As I've mentioned in my first box talks, distributors specifically avoided words like horror, terror, and blood to avoid censorship, whether that is various theaters saying we do not want to show this to audiences, or rather people thinking that this is too graphic for them to watch. And so the whole crux of the Dracula marketing is we don't want this to be marketed as a horror film, but it still became one anyways. Ironically, the horror label pushed the film to become a major success and paved the way for the horror genre. In a sense, the failure of the censorship was a boon for marketing. They kind of failed upwards. So, we've covered the marketing aspect. Let's talk about the content. So, while censorship is a threat to the marketing aspect, we have to ask what specifically causes films to be censored. Namely, like, what content do they consider worthy of censorship? Censorship for film is largely rooted within what society considered, air quotes, immoral at the time, and as such, what was grounds for censorship changed over time, much like the definition of horror, smile, if that sounds familiar. Films that were censored in an era in earlier years had uncut releases in later years, and that was simply because censorship changed. What content the censorship boards deemed not good for a specific audience changed. And please keep an eye on this aspect, the fact that films were censored in earlier years had uncut releases. This is actually a pretty important part for video nasties later on as well. When a film was censored, it's often because they displayed content such as the common no-nos, as I'd like to say. This is not a legitimate term, this is my definition, but these are things like we commonly agree as topics that would be worthy of censorship, excessive violence, sex, crime, drug usage, so on and so forth. However, there are other things that could get your film censored. What content at the time needed to be censored? And in order to understand that, we turn to the don'ts and be carefuls. This is one of the first ever documents that dealt with film censorship. So what was the don'ts and be carefuls? Yes, that was the actual name of this document. These are a set of guidelines for self-regulation. Note that I italicized that. That's going to be very important later on. Created by major studios for major studios. So think Paramount, Universal, so on and so forth. This was passed on June 29th, 1927 by the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA. That is a mouthful. I'll refer to it as the MPPDA from going on. This document, much like the title says, is essentially split between 11 don'ts and 26 be carefuls. In short, this was a case of please don't show and please have special care when shown on film. These set of guidelines would serve as the foundation for the Hays Code, a more formal set of rules that would apply to most studios and productions. But before we can talk about the Hays Code, we have to delve into this entire document a little bit more. So, starting with the don'ts. What were these and what was considered a don't? Well, according to the official wording, it follows as such. Those things which are included in the following list shall not appear in pictures produced by members of this association, irrespective of the manner in which they are treated. In short, don't do this, otherwise it won't be screened. And there are 11 of these, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to show some examples. Keep in mind that these rules were made in the late 1920s and reflect the social climate at the time. So, here are some examples real quick. This is a long one. Pointed profanity, either by title or lip. This includes the words God, Lord Jesus Christ, unless they be used reverently in connection with proper religious ceremonies, hell, SOB, damn, God, and every other profane and vulgar expression, however it may be spelled. Any licentious or suggestive nudity, in fact or in silhouette, and any lecherous or licentious notice thereof by other characters within the picture. Nothing too suggestive, essentially. White slavery. This translates to sexual exploitation and slavery. I mean, I've always had the trouble with this word. Miscegenation, which is mixed race couples. You could not show mixed race couples on screen according to the don'ts and be carefuls. And another example is the ridicule of clergy. Also, willful offense to any nation or creed. Now this one is, at least in my opinion, very funny, and considering that we just talked about how the document stated that we would not like you to show any mixed race couples on screen. There's a little bit of contradictions within the document. Again, these are just examples. These are just some of the don'ts from the entire list. If you want to look at the entire lists, I implore you to look up the entire list after this box talks. So, with that said, let's move on to the be carefuls. What was defined as a be carefuls? According to the official wording, special care must be exercised in the manner in which the following subjects are treated, to the end that vulgarity and suggestiveness may be eliminated and that good taste may be emphasized. This meant, essentially, be careful about showing this, and if you are showing it, make sure it's in, air quotes, good taste. Or rather, what society deemed as good taste back in the early 1920s. Much like the don'ts, there are a good handful of be carefuls, 26 of them. So, like before, I will be going over just a few examples. These are all okay to show in film, and they had to do so in a light that was agreeable to the audiences. In other words, typically the producers, since they were in charge of self-censorship. Examples: use of the flag. Be careful about the use of the flag, chat. Be careful about the use of displaying the international relations. Avoid picturizing in an unfavorable light another country's religion, history, institutions, prominent people, and citizenry. Another thing to be careful was sympathy for criminals. We as a society do not like criminals at this time, and therefore, no sympathy shall be made. If they did something bad, they should be perceived as bad. No sedition here, chat. Or rather, be careful about showing sedition. We do not want any of our audiences to think that sedition is okay, so be careful about showing. You can still show it, but be careful. Titles or scenes having to do with law enforcement or law enforcing officers. We want people to think that our police and law institutions are bad. You can show them, but only in a good light. Excessive or lustful kissing, particularly where one character or the other is a heavy, and heavy in this context means an antagonist or evil individual. Again, these are just examples. There are 26 be carefuls in total. So please read through the entire don'ts and be carefuls if you're interested in reading seeing every single thing that is listed here. These were the guidelines that dictated the way filmmakers went about producing their films. However, this was merely a set of loose guidelines and in the scope of the industry. In order to make something more concrete, we turn to the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code, created by Martin Quigley, Daniel A. Lord, and various other heads of studio heads. This document serves as a set of guidelines within the film industry, telling filmmakers what they could and could not do about their could not show about their films. The code was more popularly referred to as the Hays Code, named after Will H. Hays, the director of the MPPDA. The code applied to most major studios during this lifetime, primarily from 1934 to 1968. It was formed in the 1930s, but it was loosely enforced before 1934. A change of leadership would bring it to the forefront of film censorship. And much like the previous document, the Don'ts and Be Carefuls, this has been divided into general principles and particular applications. Essentially, general rules and an exact list of what can and cannot be shown. So, let's talk about the general principles. Unlike the previous Don'ts and Be Carefuls, there are only 3 of them. These were guidelines that prevented films from lowering the moral standard in some way, shape, or form. You'll see a through line through these principles about emphasizing good and good characters. No sympathy for any. No pictures shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. This is essentially a follow-up to one of the previous ones from Don'ts and Be Carefuls. No sympathy for any criminals, acts, evil, and so on and so forth. The code wanted to promote good character first and foremost. Remember, we want to keep our audience from doing anything that would be bad in our society. Correct standards of life, subject to only the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Films should promote the right way of life, unless it was for drama or entertainment's sake. And lastly, law divine, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. In short, breaking law bad. Don't do this, don't promote this. Pretty concrete principles, right? Very simple, clear, straight to the point. There is a very strong theme of keeping the audience and society overall, since they watch these films, good. Now, moving on from general, let's talk about particular applications. There is a lot of them, so like before, I'm going to highlight some as to not spend too much time. Specifically, these are taken from the MPPC, published on December 1956. Section 1, Crime. 2. Methods of crime shall not be explicitly presented or detailed in a manner calculated to glamorize crime or inspire imitation. Section 3, Sex. This one's kind of funny. Scenes of passion, specifically. These should not be introduced except where they are definitely essential to the plot. Remember, chat, you can only add scenes of passion at the time if these were essential to the plot. This one's pretty funny. Sorry, let me get my laugh out. Obscenity. Obscenity in words, gesture, reference, song, joke, or by suggestion, even when likely to be understood by only part of the audience, is forbidden. Okay, hold on. One of you asked, what would make it essential to the plot? That depended on the director. Making a child is not plot relevant. You'd probably have to show that off screen. You'd probably have to do like a very short kiss screen, then fade to black. Cause that kind of like making a child, that would not fly under the lens of the Hays Code. As for what would make it essential to the plot, that would depend on the film. But also, I think it's a way for studios to say, we do not want anything overtly risque or sexual. So this is a fancy way of saying, keep the passion as like a seasoning. Don't make it the main dish, make it the seasoning. If I had to bring up a example, it wasn't meant to be the entire plot. It was only meant to be used sparingly. I hope that clears that up. Going back to obscenity, if any of you watch like, a show, like a children's show or like a children's movie, and there's that specific joke, they usually have like a joke that only like adult like audience members or like parents who are with their kids would get the joke. Yeah, that wasn't a thing. You could not do that under the lens of the Hays Code. No jokes, no obscene jokes, no adult jokes, even if only the adults could understand it. No such thing was allowed back in the day. Another one, national feelings. No pictures shall be produced that tends to incite bigotry or hatred among the peoples of differing races, religions, or national origins. The use of offensive words should be avoided. I am realizing that I'm covering part of that, so let me shrink myself, chat. There we go. Tiny box. Extremely small box. Okay, there we go. I'm a professional. And at least from my experience, an author's note here. This one's really interesting considering the social climate of America at the time. Racism was quite prevalent during this era, and yet they still stipulate this. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Again, please read the entire document if you want to. It is the Motion Picture Production Code, or the Hays Code. They have the entire thing there. These are examples. There are so much to cover. There's so much to cover and so little time. That being said, remember how I said a few slides earlier that the Hays Code was loosely enforced? Here's the era that it was properly enforced. Welcome to the Breen era. There was an amendment in 1934 that made it so all films needed a seal of approval if they were released on or after July 1st, 1934. Nearly all US-made films adhered to this and would do so until the Hays Code ended. Secondly, Joseph Breen was appointed head of the Production Code Administration, otherwise known as the PCA. With his introduction, the code was heavily enforced, and nothing was safe from the code. And when I mean nothing, I really mean nothing. In fact, the enforcement was so rigid that high-profile films such as the Maltese Falcon was remade as the 1931 release, and content that wasn't up to code. In fact, some pre-code films that were pulled from screens never saw the light of day. And this is the 1941 Maltese Falcon poster. It's a pretty good movie. You should watch it. It's a great noir film. Anyways, my nerding out aside. As rigid as the code was, it wasn't all doom and gloom. The rigidity forced from both the don'ts and be carefuls forced publishers to and distributors and directors to get creative. One such example was our good old master of suspense himself, Hitchcock. A prime example is his 1946 film Notorious. This film in specific had a 2.5-minute kissing scene, which would be considered under the Hays Code not good, considering it was excessive and lustful. Now, how did Hitchcock get around this? Simple. Hitchcock had dialogue every few seconds, interrupting the kissing. So, through that loophole, the scene was okay. Notorious did not get censored simply because Hitchcock decided to split up the kissing scene with dialogue every 3 seconds, so therefore, it wasn't excessive in the eyes of the code. For other films that dealt with more sensitive topics, producers and distributors marketed them as morality tales. These are films that highlighted the evil of these scandalous actions, and these films served as a warning for audiences that they wouldn't dare to do such acts themselves. And in doing so, these morality tales could show whatever they wanted. However, while all of these were great and good ways of bypassing the Hays Code, there was one major loophole that could be exploited. Also, there's the kissing scene question from Notorious. Alright, chat, if you aren't taking notes, this is the time to take notes. I'm going to show you the easiest loophole that you could abuse if you were a filmmaker, a distributor, a producer, so on and so forth in this era, right? I need you to dial in for this slide specifically, chat. All right? Are you dialed in? This is very important, okay? If you aren't taking notes, this is the one slide where you should take notes, all right? Okay, we have people locked in? All right. Here's the loophole. Ignore it. Seriously, just ignore it. I'm not joking. Just ignore it. Seriously. You see, the funny thing about the Hays Code is that you could just ignore it. Remember how I said self-censorship was the core foundation of the Hays Code? Yeah, that's also the biggest weak point of the Hays Code. The Hays Code functioned under self-censorship. This meant that studios were in charge of censoring their own films, and the MPPDA was not a government body, it is a trade association, meaning that multiple studios were part of the MPPDA. There was no relation to the government whatsoever. In fact, the Hays Code was made in fear of government regulation. The major companies were very, very scared that the government would step in and add heavy regulations, so they decided to do it themselves in order to maximize profit while also showing that they could manage the industry themselves. And since the film climate at the time, the film economy at the time, wasn't all major studios, if you were small studios, you could just ignore it. You didn't have to adhere to the code. They had smaller studios specifically had alternative places to distribute their films, and so being restricted from major cinema wasn't that big of a deal in the first place. And even if and that's not even counting the fact that you'd need to afford being distributed in such a big theater in the first place, which is why we see so many theaters here. All of these films are considered grindhouses, and we will cover grindhouses very, very soon. Also, you could just ignore it internationally. You could just ignore the Hays Code internationally. The code only applied to US studios. The Hays Code only applied to American studios. Internationally imported films were exempt from and were unrestricted from these regulations. As such, these films gained major notoriety, good and bad, within the US for their obscene and outlandish content. Some notable examples for international films that did this were Summer with Monica, 1953, directed by Ingmar Bergman. This was known specifically for its explicit sexuality and nudity depicted on screen. Another example was from Britain, The Leather Boys, directed by Fury in 1964. And this film specifically focused on the prejudices against queer individuals. Now, obviously, these two films gained notoriety for essentially covering topics that were a big no-no. And it should be noted that these two films would also be wonderful examples of exploitation cinema. Now, what is exploitation cinema? It's in the name. These are films that exploit and capitalize on trends, niches, and or sensational content to maximize profit. They want their money, chat. If I had to put it in a modern context, if you ever seen within the past few years, you know, a really popular game just burst out of the woodwork. I'm talking Lethal Company. I'm talking about Lethal Company specifically. If I had to put an exploitation cinema spin on it, you would see a bunch of, and you probably have seen a bunch of games inspired by Lethal Company. Some good, some bad. The point is, these individuals saw, oh my goodness, this is making a lot of money. Let's do our own spin on it. The friend slap trend, yes. Now, there is a difference between the friend slap and exploitation cinema. The term exploitation cinema is a very broad category. It's an umbrella term. But all of these films do have common traits. They are very low budget B movies. Again, these were low budget B movies churned out at a high volume for the sake of money. Low quality, high volume. Money is the name of the game. They want to make as much money as possible. This is a case of quantity over quality for profit. And these are often screened at grindhouses and drive-ins, as you see with our picture. Those are grindhouses. Both of these venues allowed exploitation films to thrive, as its owners relied heavily on low-budget films to draw in audiences, and these specific venues grew in popularity between the 1960s and 1980s. It's a case of Sakurachi saying, so not to even trying to reinvent the game with their own twist, just make the same thing. Essentially, yes. Think of it as trying to remake a popular film or piece of artwork, but not differentiating enough. Literally just copying a film and making the evermost minute changes. Sure, there would be changes in plot, characters, settings, but nothing that would make it stand out. It's just trying to capitalize on the trend that a major film set, first and foremost. That being said, the defining film for that genre or wave of exploitation films, those originating films would often be associated with them. But those films are good. Like, production-wise, they're good. Yeah, essentially, like Seal said, guys like the Mona Lisa, here's the Bona Bisa. It was that simple. There'd be a Bona Bisa, a Mona Misa, a Lona Lisa. Just, people wanted to capitalize on the newest trend, the newest thing, because they saw that was making money. Again, film is an industry. You want to make as much money as possible. So what do? They copy the biggest trends, niches, or sensational content going around the time. That's just how exploitation of cinema works. Money, 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 money. So, we've talked about, we're continuing, right? These films actually began to pop up as early as the 1930s and 1940s. As I mentioned before, these films back then were marketed as hygiene films or morality tales. These titles are specifically used as a way for distributors to weasel through the wall that was censorship. While exploitation cinema started early, these came into its prime by the 1960s up until the 1980s. And this, funny enough, coincided with when the Hays Code died out. With the eventual abandonment of the Hays Code in the late 1960s due to internal strife within the MPPDA, many filmmakers were able to get approval for films that freely showed content that would normally get them censored. Given the massive scope of exploitation cinema, there's countless subgenres to be found, and certain subgenres are closely linked to the year/era that it was released. Remember, trends and fears changed with the time, and those who wanted to profit had to chase these trends no matter how big the change in topic or trend was. Remember, money, money, money. So, there's a blank slide. Now that we've talked about no wait, it's not a blank slide. I'm doing so great, chat. I need water. now that we've talked about now that I've given you a general overview about exploitation cinema, let's talk about some of the subgenres. As I've said before, there is a lot of subgenres. Way too many. Much like the don'ts and be carefuls and the Hays Code, there are simply way too many for a humble box being as myself to cover in one box talks. And if I did, we'd have multiple box talks about the subject, and I'd like to cover other topics. So, for the sake of my own sanity, I'll be showcasing subgenres that I find interesting or important to understanding what exploitation cinema is, starting with hygiene films. One of the earliest forms of exploitation films, these films often had stories that centered around sexual health and primarily had to focus on STDs or STIs, but they could also focus on other related topics such as birth control or prostitution. These films were produced by mainstream studios, and many considered these films as ways to educate audiences in spite of the controversial topics. Though, as time went on, they grew to display graphic depictions that pushed to become an exploitation genre. Kroger Bab's Mom and Dad, released in 1945, became a prime example of hygiene films. This became one of the highest-grossing films of the 1940s amidst the countless controversies, thanks to both its content and Bab's marketing and promotion. Again, many early exploitation films got around the censorship because they were rebranded as educational. So, there's one. Let's talk about the drug and stoner films, or stoner films. Much like hygiene films, this subgenre has roots as early as the 1930s and 1940s. Films produced in this era were meant to scare the audience, as public paranoia surrounding drugs, namely marijuana, was at an all-time high. This would later become a genre. This would later shift from a genre promoting fear to a genre that promotes laughter, as these films were rediscovered and used as a way to capitalize on the growing stoner culture of the 70s. A prime example, and a personal favorite of mine, is Reefer Madness. This was a 1936 film directed by Herliman that was initially about the PSAs, which was initially a PSA film about the dangers of weed. It was rediscovered and rebranded as a, comedy and marketed as a satire, as a way for to get users of weed to view the film. Also, quick side note, adults only, yes. And also, as a quick side note, it has a musical. It's a really good musical. Watch it. It's great. Seriously, it's a really good musical. Really good. Watch it. It's great. Alright. Moving on to Mondo films. What were these? Mondo films are exploitative documentary films that focus on foreign cultures and taboo subjects. Note how there's a quote, notice how I put quotes around documentary? These films are entirely staged with the intention to shock and or scare audiences. Mondo films have a tendency to over-sensationalize topics they show on screen, often causing other cultures to be perceived as weird and or brutish. Later Mondo films would include footage of the dead, real and staged, as another means to shock their viewers. Mondo cane, I believe, it's an Italian word. Forgive me if there are any Italians watching, I'm so sorry. It's gonna get worse. I'm trying my best to pronounce it though. Mondo Cane was a film that was largely responsible for the influx of other Mondo films. An international success, the film's sporadic presentation of countless cultural practices was the foundation for the subgenre as a whole. Now, blaxploitation films. This is a subgenre that was riding off the wave of the civil rights and Black Power movement. Blaxploitation films are primarily action films that featured black actors in urban settings, often black communities, marketed specifically for black audiences. Many saw these films as a way to promote Black Power, highlighting social and political issues that were often ignored in Hollywood at the time. Conversely, others often argued that the depiction of black communities and individuals on screen continued to perpetuate common stereotypes that had been placed on them by the white community. The term blaxploitation was coined by Eunice Griffith. I hope I'm pronouncing that, Griffith. I'm sorry if I messed that up. As a criticism to Hollywood's representation of African Americans, namely how the genre is perpetuating stereotypes. Regardless of the original connotation of the term, it has been used to describe all films from this genre. Both Shaft and Coffee are prime examples of the blaxploitation genre, with the former bringing African American culture to the mainstream, and the latter known for its black female protagonist. Bless Pam Grier. Pam Grier is such a good actress. Okay, I'm gonna slide in some bits of nerding out here, but bless Pam Grier. Bless her soul. Anyways, shall we continue? Chanbada or Chambada, depending on who you ask. Let's move internationally, shall we? These are a subcategory of jidaigeki films, also known as pop samurai films. For those who do not know what a jidaigeki is, these are Japanese period drama. These films are set during the Tokugawa era, usually focusing on samurai or ronin dealing with the major changes that came from Japan's shifting reliance on the feudal system. There was after World War II, where there was a notable shift where jidaigeki films shifted from more dramatic stories to more action-oriented cinema. I think works from Kurosawa or Shindo would pave the way for works from Kurosawa and Shindo would pave the way for Chambada films. These films in particular would focus on revenge plots, sex, swordplay, and heavy use of blood. Kazuo Koike, again, forgive my pronunciation. Kazuo Koike's works are the ones most closely related to the genre, where his Lone Wolf and Cub series would have numerous films produced, along with 2 series found only on television. There is one of the posters from the series. Now, this might sound familiar to y'all. You know it, you love it, you may have watched one of these recently. It's them good old spaghetti westerns. Sorry, had to put in the western accent somewhere, right? I didn't think these were exploitation films, huh? Think again, these are. Their namesake was derived from the fact that these westerns were produced in Europe. Namely, these were Italian-directed and Italian-produced westerns. Actually, another fun fact is that the majority of these westerns were international co-productions, with Spain and Italy being constant collaborators. They were often low-project productions, primarily shot in southern Italy, and Spain. And I'd be remiss not to talk about Sergio Leone and his many works surrounding spaghetti westerns. If you've heard of Sergio Leone, you'll probably be aware of his dollar series, A Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. These films basically established spaghetti westerns and are often regarded highly as western films in general. Like, these are highly regarded western films. These are really good western films. Goes to show you that genres we see today fall into this category, and we're gonna run into a few more familiar ones, or rather one more familiar one, very soon. But yeah, spaghetti westerns are considered an exploitation film subgenre. Interesting, right? Alright, now let's talk about giallo films. This is continuing our international focus, and again, I apologize, I'm not Italian. If there are any Italians watching this, I am so sorry. So, what are giallo films? These are murder mystery films, blending aspects of thrillers, horrors, and eroticism. Plots often focused on a mysterious, unidentified killer whose identity was only revealed at the end. A major inspiration for these films actually comes from a series of mystery, pulp, horror, and thriller novels titled Il Giallo Mondadori, with the genre's name stemming from how these books have a yellow color, hence the name Giallo. Dario Argento's Deep Red, or otherwise known as Profondo Rosso, is a prominent example of giallo cinema, being cited as one of the defining entries. Giallo cinema would peak within the 70s, but it would quickly decline in the late years. However, even if it did fade away, it wouldn't do so quietly because it influenced slashers. You know them, you love them, you probably love them, and you may have seen one last Halloween. These too are considered a subgenre of exploitation films, and rightfully so. For they took heavy inspiration from giallo films, but also Hitchcock's Psycho as well, and Powell's Peeping Tom. Following the namesake, slasher films often had stories revolving around a killer or a group of them, stalking and murdering a group of poor and unsuspecting innocents, often with sharp instruments. These films are typically American produced and directed, and though there was some occasional international slasher produced as well. Of course, there are way too many slasher films for me to list, and I'm pretty sure a majority of you know at least one or two slasher films, but I'd be doing horror or slasher fans and the slasher genre a disservice if I didn't, cover some. So I'm just gonna list some to cover my bases, to show that I'm a true film fan, Many examples include the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, so on and so forth. If you know about slashers, you probably know. If you've heard about slashers, you probably know one or two of these films, or all of them, because they're really famous. But yeah, these are the exploitation film. This is an exploitation film subgenre. And it surprised me, but it also makes sense. Remember that there are so many films. When you talk about slashers, there are so many films. And once you put it under the lens of exploitation cinema, mind you, the term exploitation cinema does not always mean, it's not a negative term. It's just a statement. It's not a negative term. It isn't a term that looks down on the subgenre. This is just a way of saying, here is a subgenre that a bunch of directors, producers, and filmmakers wanted to exploit. Here's a trend that they wanted to exploit, so they exploited it. And they did. Because there's so many slashers, there's so many westerns, some of which still carry on today, even though they aren't considered exploitation films anymore. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, so many slashers. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them with high production, some of them with low production. Most of the films here, I think, are on the lower end of production, but they still managed to make a massive impact on film history, and horror specifically. So again, just because it's called an exploitation film subgenre doesn't mean that it's a bad film. It isn't a bad genre. We've covered some earlier that were questionable, yes, but not all of them had evil intent, rather. So now we're gonna make a complete abrupt turn to talk about the United Kingdom and its relationship to the VHS. I promise this will make sense very quickly with all of the exploitation film talk and legislation talk. So, how many of you know what a VHS is? Have you used a VHS? I've actually mentioned to use some before. I had a VHS growing up. I had a VHS growing up. I remember putting in tapes, recording things. It was great. But we're not here to talk about my memories of VHS. Ooh, your family still has a lot of VHSs, but not a player? Nice. Alright. So for those who do not know what a VHS is, the video home system, or as we commonly know it, VHS began to see increasing popularity, specifically in relation to the UK, in the 70s. More and more houses within the United Kingdom adopted this new system, and with such a system came many opportunities to make profit. However, Given its infancy, many distributors are reluctant to place their films into this new market, and understandably so, given that machines can make piracy very easy. As such, smaller independent distributors dominated the space, and with them came a myriad of low-budget horrors. Does that sound familiar? A market dominated by smaller independent distributors that produced a bunch of low-budget horrors? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyways, regardless if a VHS film was from a major or minor distributor, they still had to be approved by the British Board of Film Classification, otherwise known as the BBFC. Well, they should have been. You see, here's the tiny thing about legislation around this era. With how new VHS was, there were a few loopholes that it could exploit to skirt through legislation. One of the biggest one was that at the time, videos were not considered films, so they could essentially bypass the BBFC's review process. This meant that VHS tapes were free from both the restriction of censorship and classification. In fact, there was no legislation specifically for the regulation of VHS, with one exception being the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. But this only affected distributors and retailers. So distributors and retailers could only be prosecuted, which meant films could still be released. Nothing was stopping films from being released, in spite of distributors and retailers being prosecuted. It was clear that there needed to be proper guidelines in handling this. In the meantime, these newfangled videos were the Wild West, with no regulations, and with how commonplace VHS was meant that the unregulated content was available to everyone and anyone. The very thought proved to be a considerable fear, considering video nasties. These came to public attention. What are video nasties? Well, video nasties are low-budget horror films, low-budget horror exploitation films that primarily reach audiences, both willing and unwilling, through VHS. And these were commonly produced by either the US or Italy and often featured violent and obscene content. As I stated before, these were commonplace thanks to the previously discussed loophole through BBFC's review system. With no hurdles and distributors and filmmakers to jump through, many of these films easily found their way into UK household. This all culminated in a massive public panic, as many parents feared that the youth were being exposed to easily accessible content that was deemed morally unhealthy. Two films, namely The Driller Killer and Cannibal Holocaust, were largely responsible for bringing attention to the video nasties. So, with a movement against video nasties made, who was the figure leading this? Let me introduce you to Mary Whitehouse. Mary Whitehouse is a teacher and conservative activist. She's the figure most closely associated with video nasties and the campaign against them. In fact, she's the one who coined the coin video nasty. Furthermore, Whitehouse was both the founder and the president of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, which I'll refer to as NVALA, used it as a platform to push for better regulations and classifications for VHS, amongst other issues she felt needed to be addressed. Her efforts helped form some pieces of key pieces of legislation, such as the Video Recordings Act of 1984, which we will cover after we talk about the DPP list and its relation to the Obscene Publications Act of 1959. We need to talk about these two because these are very, very intertwined. Starting with the DPP list, this list was made public by the Director of Public Prosecutors on June 1983, where it sought to prosecute 72 films under Section 2 of the Obscene Publications Act. Now, a Section 2 charge meant that both dealers and distributors were liable for prosecution if caught, and if successful meant that the film could not be distributed or sold until obscenity was quashed. In short, if you get caught, you can't sell the film until it was deemed okay by the Parliament. Excuse me, chat. The 72 films are split further, with 39 being successfully prosecuted. Some of these films have been cut and reapproved for release or remained banned. The other 3 have been dropped, whether it was through unsuccessful prosecution or not being prosecuted at all. These films were moved from a Section 2 to a Section 3 classification. Now, what is a Section 3 classification? Section 3 film was liable to be confiscated under a less obscene charge. This is because a less obscene charge where distributors could not be prosecuted under this. This is because obscenity was admitted through forfeiting the material. Sorry. This was because obscenity was admitted through the act of forfeiting the offending material. Furthermore, there was an additional list that featured 82 other films that fell under Section 3. The following slides will cover a few examples from these lists specifically. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot. There's a lot of films. I'm not covering 72 films plus 82 more in one box talks. That's way too much. I'm sorry. So I'm going to be covering some examples. Starting with Cannibal Holocaust, released in 1980, directed by Nogueira Deotardo. This had a 2001 release with 5 minutes and 44 seconds cut due to content. In 2011, it had a re-release with only 15 seconds cut. Another one I've mentioned before, Driller Killer, released in 1975, directed by Ferrara. I hope I'm pronouncing these names right. This had a 1990 re-release with pre-cuts. However, in 2002, it had a full uncut re-release. Another one, Last House on the Left, directed by Wes Craven, released in 1972, was one of the final 39 that was successfully prosecuted. It refused certificates in 1974, 2000, and 2001. It did not see release or get certification. However, in 2002, it did get a release with 31 seconds cut. Furthermore, it got a 2008 uncut release. Some few examples from the Drop 33. Hey, that's a familiar film, ain't it, chat? Yes, we're talking about The Evil Dead, released in 1981. You know it, you love it. It's pretty groovy. So this passed in 1981 with cuts, and was re-released in 1990 with 2 minutes cut. It also had a full uncut release in 2001. Another film, I Miss You, Hugs and Kisses, released in 1978, directed by Markowitz. This had a 1986 release with 1 minute and 6 seconds cut, and had no further re-releases. And we moved to The Beyond, released in 1981, directed by Fulci. This was passed with cuts for cinema, but had a 1987 release with 2 minutes cut, and then had a 2001 release that was entirely uncut. Now, some examples from Section 382. Remember, Section 3 films are different from Section 2 films. So keep that in mind. A lot of these might be familiar. Dawn of the Dead, directed by George Romero, released in 1978. These passed with heavy cuts. However, in 1989 and 1987, these passed with cuts as well. And finally had a full uncut release in 2003. Another familiar one, or rather, 2 familiar ones, Friday the 13th, released in 1980, directed by Cunningham. The 1987 had an R-rated release and came unrated and uncut in 2003. The sequel, Part 2, directed by Miner, released in 1981, had a 1987 R-rated uncut release. And then 2008 was released with a uncut but rated 15 within the UK rating system. With all of these covered, you may have noticed that a majority of these were managed to get a release around the mid-1980s. That is because a certain piece of legislation was passed during this time frame. And this may sound very familiar because I covered it a few slides ago. The Video Recordings Act of 1984. This was the British Parliament's response to video nasties, and with it came some major changes. As such, the British Board of Film Censors became the British Board of Film Classification. They became the main body that dealt with both film and video certification, and this meant that videos could no longer slip through the cracks and go unchecked. Furthermore, releases after September 1st, 1985 had to be compliant with the Video Recordings Act. Any films released before this date had to be resubmitted for classification in the following 3 years. There was also a new process for video classifications that was separate from cinema releases. Uncut films that had cinema releases became cut video releases through this new system. Also, selling unclassified films became a crime, along with selling 15 and 18 certificate videos to underage individuals as well. These changes affected every single film. Nothing was safe. Everything produced and distributed was under scrutiny from this act, regardless of whether they were high profile and low budget. With everything in place, with this new act in place, with new guidelines established, and a new process for video specifically, we come to the late 1990s and the early 2000s and the relaxation that came with it. With the introduction of the Video Recordings Act, both film and video finally had a benchmark that could be used to ensure that the right films found their way to the right audiences. Though, as the world approached closer to the 2000s, the BBFC began to relax their standards thanks to both public response and also James Furman departing from the BBFC. This led to numerous banned films being reappraised, with official Nasties seeing releases as cuts, as we've seen with previous examples from the Final 39. Another example, if I had to just pick one real quick, was following Furman's departure specifically, was The Exorcist. Why was it reappraised? Well, it's because that the British release was blocked by Furman himself, though it managed to get a release in 1999 after Furman's retirement. And with everything said, that's all, folks. That's everything. That is Video Nasties, Exploitation Cinema, and Censorship. I blanked out on Censorship. Send help. That's everything. That is a whole bunch of films and censorship to talk about. But that's everything. I wish I could cover more, but I only allocate like an hour. I want to keep this to an hour long, and I timed it, and if I kept more slides, it would have gone for a bit longer. And I value my voice and I value my voice and my sanity. That's it, chat. That is everything. That is everything. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening, chat. Thank you all. Say bye to the recording. Say bye to YouTube, chat. Say bye to YouTube real quick. Say so long and farewell. Say bye-bye before I cut the recording. Smile. Thank you, YouTube. Thank you for those watching on YouTube. You can catch more of this, hopefully, more often on my Twitch, which should be in the link. Aside from that, I hope you found anything. I hope you found this entire live recording interesting. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I hopefully will post more film and or lower centric shenanigans, along with my clips from my stream. So hopefully I will see some of you there, some YouTube people from there in my streams. So from that, thank you all, chat. Take care and bye bye.